The northern states will ratify most of them. As I figure, it remains for 2 of the southern states to do the same, even after all are readmitted. And I've been working on that.
Tennessee and Louisiana.
Arkansas, too, most likely. It'll be ratified. Slavery, sir. It's done. If we submit ourselves to law, even submit to losing freedoms, the freedom to oppress, for instance, we may discover other freedoms previously unknown to us.
I welcome this kind of examination.
Round up the usual suspects.
They are who we thought they were, and we let them off the hook.
Do it live. I'll write it, and we'll do it live.
You know, they do this to me all the time. I don't know what the hell they do it for, but goddamn it, if we can't come out of a slow record, I don't understand it. Is Don on the phone?
That it is immoral and wrong that the top 1/10 of 1% in this country own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%.
I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it.
They will note merely that I was among the senators who determined that what the president did was wrong.
Meeting in the middle of the desert always made me nervous. It's a scary place.
Whoever told you that you could work with men?
If ISIS started a streaming service, you'd call your agent.
And for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
It's morning again in America.
This is the Midnight Writer News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hi, this is Thurston Clark. You're listening to the Midnight Writers News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Writer News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 152, Harold Holzer on Abraham Lincoln. Our guest tonight is one of the greatest Lincoln historians that we have today, and he's also a prolific author, Harold Holzer. Now, Mr. Holzer is the author of the new work, The Presidents versus the Press, the endless battle between the White House and the media, from the Founding Fathers to fake news. He'll join us next in the Midnight Hour. So for now, let's clean this castle, shall we? Now, we're not quite sure what the end of 2020 will bring. I know a lot of people out there are saying, thank God it's over, but maybe we should hold our tongues on that until we see what 2021 begets. So what we do know and what we can tell you is that in 2021, MidnightWriterNews.com will transform to being a site dedicated solely to the Midnight Writer News Show, to Garrison, the Journal of History and Deep Politics, and to the other releases from Midnight Writer News Publishing. It will also include, yes, the periodic contributions that we do receive from our friend Doug Horn. They'll stay there. Our articles, specifically my own, will be located at a new site that we've set up with Substack. Now, after looking around at Medium and all the other blogging options, we've decided to follow Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald over to Substack, and I think it's going to be a great decision for writing, especially. So if you go to stpatrick.substack.com, you'll see a place where you can enter your email address. Now, that's stpatrick.substack.com, with Substack being spelled Substack, Substack. So when a new essay is released, the essays will be in line, of course, with the topics that we discuss on the show. It will come directly to you in a very nicely formatted email so you can read it right there. That way you don't have to worry about URLs, you don't have to worry about clicks, you don't have to worry about clicking here and then clicking there and then clicking here and then reading a list and figuring out what you've read, because all the new essays will come directly to you. It's really, really very nice, and it looks fantastic. So right now we're offering this for free, though there will be opportunities for you to help with everything we do with small contributions in the future. But there will always be a free component for that. Now, I know some people are going to ask that. Yes, there will always be a free component to it with free articles. But as I've said throughout the years, this is not easy and this is not cheap. If we could possibly ask you humbly to contribute the price of one McDonald's trip, or especially one Walmart trip a month, to something that you care about and something that we do for you and that we do for the students who use this work, then we'd like to ask you to do that. So that's stpatrick.substack.com. stpatrick.substack.com. Thank you, and we'll be right back with Harold Holzer.
This is Lieutenant Colonel Jim Wilbanks, author of The Tet Offensive, A Concise History. for more on the 1968 Tet Offensive attacks on South Vietnam and how they changed both the course of the war and Lyndon Johnson's presidency, join me on episode 43 on the Midnight Rider News Show.
Of what is a pretty vast and, yes, ever-growing collection of Lincoln works, the names you see most on the spines on my bookshelves are Harold Holzer and Ed Steers. Now, as an Illinoisan who grew up believing that our blood was comprised of plasma, platelets, blood cells, and Abe Lincoln, you can imagine what a thrill this is for me this evening. Harold Holzer, who can be found at haroldholzer.com, is the winner of the 2015 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, is one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era, a prolific writer and lecturer, and a frequent guest on television. Holzer has also served for 6 years as the chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation. For the previous 10 years, he co-chaired the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission appointed by President Clinton. President Bush awarded Holzer the National Humanities Medal in 2008, and in 2013, Holzer wrote an essay on Lincoln for the official program at the re-inauguration of President Obama. He is now the co-chairman of the Lincoln Forum, and yes, my friends and countrymen, he knows of which he speaks. I should also point this out, that he has authored, co-authored, or edited 54 books. Wow. Mr. Holzer is one of my favorite authors on the bookshelves, and he's one of the best C-SPAN lecturers on Lincoln as well. So check him out on C-SPAN. He's all over C-SPAN as well. So you can see him speak on multiple occasions, and they're all worthy of your time. So welcome to the show, Mr. Holzer. This is a real honor.
Well, thank you for saying those nice things. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. Now let's go ahead and just dive into this because I have so much to ask you this evening.
Sure.
Now, Lincoln had just ran against the little giant Stephen Douglas for the U.S. Senate seat in Illinois in 1858, and it was a race which many now associate with the famous series of debates, 7 of them actually, that the two candidates engaged in around the state. Now, as a school child in Illinois, you go to these sites and you usually watch a reenactment of the debate that had occurred at that specific site. It's really an interesting thing as a kid. But statues and placards do still commemorate those sites, like I said, and they are still there. So they're a big part of Illinois' history. And in accepting the Republican Party's 1858 nomination, by the way, Lincoln delivered the House Divided speech in which he states that a house divided against itself cannot stand and a government cannot endure half free and half slave. Lincoln draws a political line in the sand during this race. So I guess you could say that overstating this race is a pretty impossible thing to do historically. It is very important. However, Lincoln loses to Douglas in 1858, and this, of course, after failing to garner enough support in 1856, 2 years earlier, to get on the ticket as the VP candidate for John C. Fremont. So Lincoln's had 2 fairly disappointing election cycles where maybe lost is too harsh of a word, but he underperforms, at least in the outcome. Still yet, and I think this is illustrative of Lincoln's psyche, he decides that he's going to passively run for the presidency. Now, the country had continued during these years to tear itself apart during the abject failure that was the James Buchanan administration. Buchanan, as you know, is still ranked last in all the presidential performance surveys, and I can't imagine a time when he's not. But what was it about Lincoln, about the man, after these political disappointments of 1856 and 1858, that believed that he would be the one the country wanted or needed at this time, and that if he could accomplish what would have to be done, that he could be the man for all time?
Well, first of all, he had enormous self-confidence, so I think he saw a destiny in national leadership, and he also was witnessing a surge in popularity of this new Republican Party. So even though he loses the Senate race in 1858, his party did win the popular vote in that statewide election. In those days, senators were chosen by legislatures, not by direct vote. So Illinois is like the quintessential purple state. Lincoln was a vote watcher, so he's looking at the presidential elections of 1852 and 1856. He even knows district-by-district votes, according to witnesses who saw him on the legal circuit in 58 and 59. So he's seeing a trend line that is favoring Republicans as the years go by. Why? More German immigrants are moving in. That's changing the outcome. It's interesting that immigration is doing it. But a lot of people in the Republican Party, as they got close to 1860, thought that the future rested in the West. In other words, they had a very famous front runner in William Seward of New York, and Seward would certainly win the eastern states in 1860, but would he win western states? Well, they thought maybe not, and you couldn't win with just the East. Well, a man like Lincoln or Salmon Chase of Ohio or maybe Edward Bates of Missouri, Westerners could win the East and maybe compete in Illinois and Indiana. So that was the math. That was why the Republicans had an edge. That's why a Westerner had an edge within the Republican Party. And look, Lincoln got tremendous national coverage out of those debates that he lost. And he also was smart enough to make a scrapbook of the transcripts and have it published nationally a month or a few weeks even before the Republican convention. So he was playing all the games, all the right cards. The convention was in Chicago. That was another brilliant effort by the state Republican Party. Get the convention to the West. So he had a lot of things going for him. And I would add self-confidence is that extra there.
Who would have been his leading supporters within the Republican Party when he's deciding whether or not to even allow himself to be a candidate?
Well, he won't run unless he gets the state of Illinois Republican Convention to name him as the favorite son, until he can get the Chicago Tribune to endorse him for president. And even before he goes to New York to deliver what I have called in my books the speech that made Lincoln president, the Cooper Union Address, he lines up Illinois. That's the key. So that's the lead. I would say that Joseph Medill and Charles Ray at the Chicago Tribune were probably the most important supporters he had. The national editors were not in his column when that convention began. Henry Raymond, the founder of the New York Times, was for Seward. Horace Greeley, the founding editor of the New York Tribune, for some reason was for Bates because he hated Seward and he didn't really like Lincoln all that much. He knew him enough not to like him. So once he wins the nomination, then all of these powerful editors rally to his support, and it's really a campaign that's waged in the newspapers and on the streets, not by the candidates themselves. So I would, let me answer the way Lincoln might answer that question. Lincoln cautioned the local people who really wanted him to win. His idea was we should be everybody's second choice, which was a brilliant strategy. Don't forget, Lincoln is as great a politician as he is an orator, and he's just a great strategist. If he realized Seward was so much a favorite that he could easily win on the first ballot, and that would be that. But if he faltered, Lincoln thought that people would begin turning to him, and he was absolutely right. After that first ballot, Seward fell short, but Lincoln was in second place. And then on the subsequent ballots, little by little, votes peeled away from other state favorite sons like Chase of Ohio and Cameron of Pennsylvania, Bates of Missouri, and it all fell to Lincoln because, as he wisely prophesied, he would be the second choice of everybody. It's hard to believe that that was the way nominees were chosen in the age before primaries, but that's the way it worked. And we got some pretty good people out of the convention system.
It is amusing to think that there was a time when every state's attorney and business professional in town wasn't vying to get their foot planted on the ladder of political ascendancy in some kind of way as they are now. This idea of not campaigning and having that sort of, I'll run if I'm drafted by my esteemed party officials, that kind of attitude is so completely anathema to how politics are now.
Yeah, of course, yes, there was this kind of Victorian, if you come to me, I will serve kind of a diffidence and reticence. But, Lincoln may have said things like, "Oh, the taste is in my mouth a little." That was his only expression of interest. But behind the scenes, he was churning the waters so that he would be a viable candidate. It's just they didn't express it the way they do now. They don't come down the escalator the way Donald Trump did at Trump Tower. They don't go back to Scranton to announce at their birthplace. It's they seem to let it come to them. But I would say that ambition and strategy has not changed all that much.
It is amusing to think that there was a time when every state's attorney and business professional in town weren't vying to get their foot planted on the ladder of political ascendancy.
I know.
The idea of not campaigning and having that sort of "I'll run if I'm drafted by my esteemed party head" sort of attitude is so completely anathema to how politics are now. I
know. Well, the Democrats, it was always much harder for the Democrats because until FDR, the Democrats required 2/3 majority, not just 50% plus one. So their balloting went on forever and ever, and that's why they wound up so often with more often than the Republicans with dark horse candidates like James Cox, who nobody remembers, who wound from Ohio, who ran such a bad race against Warren Harding. So Roosevelt had to win 2/3 in 1932 to get the nomination. So Polk, another dark horse. Republicans, they organized well. It was just a simple majority. And had not the Democrats had that 2/3 rule, Stephen Douglas would have been nominated on the first ballot because he won 50% on the first ballot. The Democratic Party would not have split after just deadlocking, and Lincoln might have had a far different and far tougher race in the general election.
Well, Stephen Douglas dies not long after this. He dies in June of 1861, I believe, which would have been 3 months after Lincoln takes office. Now, Lincoln and Douglas are permanently tied because of debates, and I understand that. That's usually the sole instance of Douglas even making it into the history curriculum. But I've always wondered what kind of animosity existed between Lincoln and Douglas towards the end, especially in 1861.
It's a great question, and it's a timely question. How do you handle defeat? Douglas probably knew he was going to lose. I would venture to say most political people know when they're going to win or lose, especially now with polling, even though we've come to, with good reason, distrust polling. But Douglas realized he had a fractured party, 3 candidates running, plus Lincoln. And what he did was, there weren't really concessions in those days, which we seem to be so breathlessly anticipating right now. But he spent the transition period, as we now call it, which Henry Adams called a secession winter, or winter of secession. Douglas spent it traveling and urging southern states to remain in the Union. But I think most powerfully of all, at the inaugural ceremony on March 4th, 1861, he was sitting in the front row on the portico of the Capitol, and as Lincoln took his place to give his speech, in those days the speech came first, and then the swearing in second, Lincoln kind of awkwardly arrived at the podium with a cane, all the papers, heavily edited speech, and a top hat. And he needed to put something down somewhere because he needed to take his glasses out, for one thing, to read the speech. And he looked around, and Douglas leaned forward and took his hat and held his hat during the inaugural ceremony. That is a pretty powerful reminder that in the end, it's supposed to be that we're all Americans. And that was a gesture that most of the people who saw it never forgot. And yes, he did die about 6 months later, still trying to argue the South back into the Union.
The dynamic of the Lincoln-Douglas rivalry is really astonishing as well as deep-seated. And imagine having that campaign for the Senate in 1858, doing it all across Illinois, and then coming back 2 short years later and doing it once again on the national stage. You know, for two Illinoisans to meet head-to-head in that time, and with the country crumbling underneath them, both, we didn't really know then, in the last 5 years of their tumultuous political and personal lives. When we think of American political rivalries, I think we have to think of Adams v. Jefferson. We think of Hamilton v. Jefferson. But I think Lincoln-Douglas has to be top 3, and maybe even the top U.S. political rivalry that didn't include Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, they had a long time. They had a 30-year rivalry. And I would say, you know, people like to say they were in the same social circle and they liked each other. I don't think they liked each other at all. Nor do I think that, you know, as much as Mary Lincoln liked to fantasize about it, I don't think that he was really a serious contender for Mary Todd's hand. For one thing, she never would have cast her lot with a Democrat. Her father was too big time a Whig, and you know, she had known Henry Clay as a young woman, who was Lincoln's hero. So, yeah, I think they didn't like each other. Douglas was a drinker, a brawler, just the opposite of Lincoln, who, you know, believed in this kind of this reasonableness, cold, calculating reason, he called it. But the fact that they were able to they had pretty angry debates, but the fact that they were able to shake hands afterwards, and, you know, Lincoln lost the Senate to Douglas, and Douglas lost the presidency to Lincoln, and life went on. It would be nice if we could see that again. But,
yes. Well,
yeah.
Well, we'll see how that turns out shortly for sure. And you know, I was recently thinking about 1/3 of what author Merrill D. Peterson called the Great Triumvirate. Right. I was thinking about John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who had actually died 10 years before the war begins. So he had been gone approximately 9.5 years by the time Lincoln is inaugurated. Right. But I was wondering if South Carolina would have still been the first state to secede had there been no John C. Calhoun, because he'd been one of the leading opponents of the Wilmot Proviso, which attempted to stop the spread of slavery into the West, and he really was the leading pro-slavery proponent in the U.S. Senate. Yeah. But it seems like Calhoun was still, even by 1860, 1861, still the greatest inspiration for South Carolinian secession, or maybe we could just say that he was the match that ignited the fire. But despite again, dying a decade earlier, do they lead the peeling off from the Union if there was no John C. Calhoun?
You know, it's a really great question. I have to say I've been doing this for 40 years, 45 years. I'm afraid to even think about how long I've been writing about Lincoln. 46 to be exact. And nobody's ever asked that question before. And I've never heard it discussed with, you know, in the Lincoln community. So it just, you know, hats off to you. Lincoln hat off to you for a great question.
Thank you.
And you know, it's very possible that your conjecture is right. Not just because Calhoun is who Calhoun is, and he's a South Carolinian, but because he had led a secession effort back in the days of Andrew Jackson, when they were pretty antagonistic toward each other. And Jackson, although, you know, a states' rights man, really pushed back on the subject of union and really went after Calhoun and the idea of nullification and secession. And maybe it fostered resentment that South Carolinians harbored for 10 years, but it also showed them that they could lead the way and dare to do it. So I don't know if there's any way of knowing whether South Carolina leads off without the Calhoun example, but I think it probably provoked them into being a little more daring and challenging.
Mm-hmm. And it must have already been difficult for the Lincoln team, as meager as it was at that time, trying to formulate what was a presidential transition in that era, because it was definitely not the bureaucratic behemoth that it is now. But
right.
While the Lincoln team is preparing for the move to Washington, D.C., what they're seeing are the southern states just secede one by one. You have South Carolina in December, and then you have Mississippi and Florida and Alabama and Georgia, Louisiana, all in January. And then the rest sort of between February and June, I think it was. But therefore, I think the problems that Lincoln believed he had as the election day results rolled in, and he knew that he was going to be the president, those problems are now magnified exponentially. So what is Lincoln and his team going through at this time?
Well, and of course it's the transition from hell. It makes the current transition look, just like showboating by comparison. Well, he's got a hell of a fix before him. He's only won 40% of the vote, not quite 40% of the popular vote. So he's a minority president. His name has not even appeared on the ballot in the Deep South. And in southern states where his name did appear, like Missouri and Virginia and Maryland, he gets an infinitesimal number of votes. He gets like 2% of the votes. So even more than Adams when he defeated Jefferson, he's the most sectional candidate in the most geographically lopsided election result in history. So what he faces in the transition is, what kind of a cabinet do I assemble? Do I just reward party faithful, or do I look for Southerners to convince the South that I'm not a radical threat? Here's another question. Do I rush to Washington quickly so I can be seen in command, even though it's 4 months, but that's a long time? He chooses not to do that, even though some people urge him to. And he also rejects the idea of putting Southerners in the cabinet, except for a Missourian, Edward Bates. No Democrats, no secessionists. And then the big question is conciliation or not. Do you issue a statement saying, I mean no harm to the South, I'm not going to threaten slavery? He was urged by lots of people to go on record and remind people that he was not an abolitionist, and he absolutely refused to do it. He said, I've written enough, I've said enough, read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, read Cooper Union. I haven't spoken publicly since February 1860. I'm not going to speak now, and he just would not do it. I don't know if it was the right move politically, and whether it would have staved off secession. I suspect not. And then he also has tremendous faith in Union sentiment in Georgia and other places, which I believe he's much too optimistic about. And finally, and this is going to ring with a familiar tone to those of us who are kind of suffering through a month after the national election in 2020. But there was a real issue about the electoral votes. Now, Lincoln, despite getting only 40%, won a clear electoral majority, because if you're one of four, if you're the only Republican in a four-way race, you're going to win a plurality, and he did. But there are threats that the electoral count is going to be delayed. It's going to be maybe even stopped. Sound familiar? It should. That there will be armed people preventing the count. By the way, in those days, and I really would suggest that we go back to this, it was much easier. There were no electors who traveled to Washington to meet in some, unruly assembly, and you didn't know whether they were going to be faithful or faithless electors. They met in their state capitals. They elected the person who won the most votes, and they sent one envelope containing the result by mail and one with a messenger all the way to Washington. But Lincoln still didn't know. It wasn't until his birthday, I think it was his birthday, when he was in Columbus, Ohio, that he got the word that even though there had been one disruption in the gallery, even though the General Winfield Scott had brought a cannon up to Capitol Hill to inhibit disruption, that, and this is a great testament to our republic, as was Al Gore's reading the electoral count when he lost a disputed election to George W. Bush in 2000. But John Breckinridge, the sitting vice president who had lost in the election to Lincoln along with Douglas, read the count and declared Lincoln the president. So it was a hellish transition. which Lincoln, and as Lincoln travels to Washington, Jefferson Davis is traveling to Montgomery, Alabama, the first capital of the Confederacy. So they're actually competing inaugural journeys. If Donald Trump is really going to do a rally at the same time as the inaugural, we've been there and done that too. In the end, the law is the law. So, as Trump would say, we'll see what happens. I feel emboldened to talk about Trump since I wrote a book that includes Trump. I haven't,
No, it's okay. And I'm actually going to ask you about the new book at the end of tonight.
I know.
And that's for everyone out there. That's The Presidents versus the Press. And we're going to talk about that later. But you mentioned that Lincoln had strict regional and ideological standards for his own cabinet.
Right.
So in thinking about that for a second, I then have to ask you, what happened between that time and the decision to appoint Southerner Andrew Johnson to the vice presidency to replace Hannibal Hamlin?
Let me just say one thing about the cabinet, if I may. In those days, it was always all about regional. You needed someone in the cabinet from every one of the big states that had supported you. So Indiana got a cabinet member, Pennsylvania got one, Ohio got one, New York got one, even Connecticut got one. And his friends in Illinois said, "Wait a minute, what about us? We're your original supporters." And Lincoln said, "Well, you don't need anyone from Illinois because you have me." Sort of struck them down about the idea of having an Illinoisan in the cabinet. And today, of course, we know because we're seeing a cabinet being assembled, it's all about ethnicity and gender. So you need women, you need people of color, Latinos. So it's a totally different set of criteria for creating a cabinet. There's no smoking gun that we know of to suggest that Lincoln was behind dumping Hannibal Hamlin in the 1864 convention, Republican, or as it was called, Union Party convention, in favor of Andrew Johnson. It made a lot of sense because when Lincoln ran 4 years earlier, he was the quintessential Westerner, and they needed an Easterner. Again, it's all about geography for balance. So you can't get much further east than Maine, so they picked a guy from Maine. Good balance. Plus the word Hamlin, right? It's like both their names in one name. How's that for an obscure fact?
I've honestly never thought of that.
Yeah. But in 64, Lincoln is like the symbol of the North and Northern Union. And so what do they calculate they need for balance this time? And remember, that was going to be a close, maybe even impossible election. Well, they wanted someone who represented the loyal, South. So they got the only United States senator from the South who had not quit during secession, Andrew Johnson, the military governor of Tennessee. Made sense. Lincoln had almost nothing to do with Hannibal Hamlin in the 4 years that he'd been vice president. It's not like today. Well, we hear about Kamala Harris and what role she'll play. The vice president played no role except to sit on Capitol Hill and wait for a tie vote or some such. It was really the warm bucket of spit job that John Nance Garner called it in 1932. All that said, I found evidence that at least two of Lincoln's personal secretaries, John Nicolay and William Stoddard, claimed in later writings that they had been dispatched to Baltimore by Lincoln for the convention with instructions to dump Hamlin for Johnson. So I think Lincoln was probably perfectly happy about the switch, and also presidents, not even Franklin Roosevelt, at death's door in 1944, really think they're going to die. They just, I'm sure Joe Biden is going to be I guess he just was 78, is talking about his re-election campaign when he's 82. So who knows? There is a sense of impregnability and immortality that these guys have, or they wouldn't get where they got.
And it's not really like he was more interactive with Andrew Johnson than he was with Hamilton. I think I read one time somewhere that he had only spoken to Johnson twice the entire time that Johnson was vice president as well. So it's not like Lincoln ever had close relationships with his vice presidents.
Yeah, with Hamlin, they met. Lincoln recalled knowing him when he had been a congressman. Hamlin, which is really bizarre, had no recollection of meeting Lincoln. I mean, I don't know how you forget meeting a guy who's 6'4" and looks like Lincoln, but they did not meet until 2 weeks after Election Day 1860. They met in Chicago, and they had a very cordial meeting. Lincoln said, "I remember you." Hamlin said, "I don't remember you." And then when Lincoln's inaugural train brought him to a certain point, it may have been New York City, I think, they reunited, and they took part of the inaugural journey together and then separated in Harrisburg again. They saw each other on inaugural day because the vice president was always sworn in first in the Senate chamber, and then they went outdoors for the presidential swearing in. I don't know of any other times they met. I mean, I'm sure Hamlin was invited to receptions at the White House, so they no doubt met there. I'm sure they did not discuss policy because it just wasn't done. Typically, in September 1862, which you think is a back-to-work time, right? Back to school, back to work. Late September, Hannibal Hamlin is in Maine. Lincoln had sort of told him not to go, but he went anyway because Lincoln knew he was about to issue a proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation. But Hamlin has no reason to be in Washington until December because that's when the new Congress convenes. It's a different schedule than we have now. Now they break for December. Then they met in December. So Hannibal Hamlin writes a letter to Lincoln congratulating him on the Emancipation Proclamation. And they're so distant that Lincoln writes him a letter saying, I'm getting praise in the newspapers and, praise. Every man likes praise, but breath alone kills no rebels. I always liked that phrase. It shows what a tough guy he was. He wanted the proclamation to kill rebels, and he wanted Hamlin to know about it in case he didn't know. So they were pretty distant. With Johnson, again, he might have been invited to White House receptions. Johnson actually writes to Lincoln and says, "I hope you will give me your permission to skip the inaugural because we have lots of problems here in Tennessee." And Lincoln let him know, "No, you're not excused from the inaugural. You have to come." And maybe Lincoln regretted that because Johnson had allegedly been feverish the night before. So he took medicine, a.k.a. brandy. And by the time he was sworn in the Senate chamber, he was pretty bombed. And, he took the Bible and grabbed the Bible out of the hand of the person who was holding it for him and kissed it and held it over his head and spoke endlessly. And Lincoln was really embarrassed. Is this the guy that I've really chosen to succeed, that sober and quiet Hannibal Hamlin? And when they walked out of the Senate chamber toward the portico of the Capitol, passing John Wilkes Booth in the rotunda, by the way, Lincoln turned to I think it was Ward Lamon, the U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia, and said, "Make sure Johnson does not speak to anyone again." And I think that was the last time they met, March 4th, 1865.
That is the definition of distance, yes. I have a feeling a lot of presidents and vice presidents, especially back in that era, were not exactly close. They weren't exactly the team that they are now. But I can definitely see that with both Hamlin and Lincoln in my reading, yes. And Harold, the work of yours, though, that I want to talk about now is the one that I've liked the most so far, and that's Lincoln and the Power of the Press. Amazing work. I personally do refer to it often, both in conversation and research. I can say that. Since I read it, it's had a great impact on the work that I do. So first, I want to say from me, thank you and congratulations on writing yet another definitive Lincoln work.
Thank you for saying it.
But now I want to ask some questions about about the main through line through that work. And I think Lincoln is criticized quite often, actually, for his treatment of the press. Some have been, though, frankly, I think, apologetic for Lincoln's actions towards the press. It's that idea of, well, he had to save the Union at the expense of the Constitution so that the Constitution could still exist afterward. I don't know. I think that's controversial, and it's absolutely arguable. And I think his treatment of the media is one of the low points, constitutionally at least, of his presidency. So this leads me to 2 points. First, I'd like to ask you if you could give us a general overview of the contention between Lincoln and the adversarial press. But then second, I'd like to ask if the treatment of the adversarial press by Lincoln was different on the East Coast than it was, for example, in the West, which was the West at the time, but now is the Midwest, where I am, in places like St. Louis or Chicago or Indianapolis.
So it's a broad question, but it's a legitimate one. And yes, you paraphrase him correctly. He said, about saving the country so the Constitution can be preserved. He put it a lot more bluntly when he said, and this rang very true to people who had seen the rash of amputations in the war. He said, you would always amputate a leg to save a body, but you wouldn't kill the body to save a leg. And the leg was the constitutional guarantees against inhibiting a free press. But he also thought that he was on constitutionally solid ground because there is a provision in the Constitution that the writ of habeas corpus, the right to demand to know what your crime was, including, libeling the government, was suspended or could be suspended in times of a rebellion, and this was surely a rebellion. So there are 2 phases of the crackdown. The first phase is between March and July of 1861, when the Union Army cracks down on press in the border states that are advocating for secession. So Fremont and Grant crack down in Missouri, in the West, as you say. The editor of a Louisville paper is arrested and sent to prison in Brooklyn, New York. In Maryland, the editor of a Baltimore paper that criticizes the way Union troops behaved at Bull Run is imprisoned at Fort McHenry. These are military prisons, by the way, without trial. Is imprisoned at Fort McHenry without a hearing, and he's the grandson of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner because of what he saw at Fort McHenry. So there's a circuitous or a circular irony here. And then the second phase is after Bull Run. The Union loses, and the loss is coincident with the end of 90 and 100-day volunteers. And the administration realizes it has to re-enlist these, hundreds of thousands of volunteers, or there can be no resistance to secession. So at that moment, newspapers in New York and New Jersey, all, pro-democratic newspapers, and I should have prefaced this by saying newspapers are either Democratic or Republican, openly so at this time. The newspapers that suggest that people shouldn't re-enlist, the government goes after, the State Department, the Post Office Department, the Army, I'm sure with the tacit approval of Lincoln, and, by the way, with the approval of Republican editors like Horace Greeley and the Chicago Tribune. It's most pronounced in 61. Editors are arrested, they're taken away to Washington, they're put in prisons, but it continues through the war. The Chicago Times is closed down in 1863 when they criticized the military trial of an Ohio ex-congressman. The New York World is suppressed in 1864 when it prints a bogus proclamation from the president. And yes, there are cases in Indiana and Illinois all through the war, smaller cases. Military people and judges crack down on the press in Philadelphia, in New Jersey, in Maine, even in 1965, a newspaper is shut down in Maine, an ostensibly religious publication. And, you know, the jury, the historical jury is out. I tend to be critical of Lincoln because he probably overreacted. But I also cut him a break because, unlike you and me and your listeners, he didn't know how the war would turn out. It was supposed to be a 1-month war, and it was a 4-year war. He did not know that the Union would survive, so he was determined to use any means at his disposal to save it. And as for the bitter pill of suspending civil liberties of all kinds, not just the press, but speech, etc., he said, yes, it was a very, very bitter emetic, you know, a purging that people were forced to take medicinally to save their country, but it was not going to last. Nobody takes an emetic when you don't need to, and he would, you know, he vowed and cited Andrew Jackson as his example, not just someone who put down secession, but someone who suppressed the newspapers in New Orleans after the Battle of New Orleans, but then let them go back to their freedoms once the city was secure and the British surrendered. So we had historical examples, and, you know, the jury's still out, as I said.
Harold, John and Jackie Kennedy lost a child while they were in the White House. For any husband and wife, that has to be painful, especially with this national spotlight ever so brightly shining, for better or for worse, upon you and your family while you are in Washington, D.C., in the nation's capital. And I'm trying to imagine the Lincolns in 1862 having just lost their son, Willie, also in the White House. And as difficult of a tragedy as that was for anyone to bear, I then try to juxtapose that loss for President Lincoln with making daily decisions to send other people's children into battle to die. Look, I know war is hell, but these two images side by side just create a baffling moral and emotional situation to me. So I guess the question I have is, how did Lincoln deal with this?
Not easily. And, you know, you can't really compare the degree of loss that parents feel. But I would submit, with all due respect to the Kennedy family, that they lost a newborn who was like 5 or 6 or 7 days old. And Lincoln lost an 11-and-a-half-year-old, who was arguably his favorite, the most like him, the most studious, the funniest, the wittiest, and the closest. You know, Lincoln really had two sets of children in a way. He had Robert and Edward when he and his wife were were first married, and little Eddie had died back in Springfield. And as many couples do when they have a loss, they had more children. So they had this second set of children. There was a big separation in age between Robert and Tad, you know, something like 9 years. And Willie was a very tough loss, and he, you know, shut himself up on the day of the death every day for a couple of months. He sought counsel from a spiritual advisor, and then ultimately he and Mary turned to spiritualism because she wanted to. It was not really a crackpot belief in the 1860s. People really believed that you could connect with the spirits in another world to gain assurance that they were in a better place. So I think it was brutal for him. And yes, I think there is a modicum of guilt about children, everyone's children die. As Lincoln said, the heavens are hung with black, you know, paraphrasing Shakespeare. The death had come to every family in the country in some way. They had relatives, you know, some fathers or sons or brothers who had died in the war. And it's probably one reason why Lincoln accepted for so many months his wife's refusal to let their oldest son enlist in the army, because he was afraid she would, you know, lose her reason if something happened to Robert as had already happened to two of their children. But ultimately got him kind of a safe sinecure with Grant's general staff a few months before the war ended, and he did just fine. But yeah, every home in the nation was suffering loss, and the president was as well.
Now, this is going to seem like a contradictory question to the last one I just asked you, but I think it's important in discussing the overarching modern themes in historiography. I really do. In Lincoln's Melancholy, Joshua Schenck wrote extensively, as you know, about how depression affected Lincoln during his years in the White House. And Schenck actually makes the argument by the end that it fueled Lincoln's greatness. So he sort of turns that depression into a positive. But I also thought that in the McCullough book on Truman, that there was a lot of talk about how much Truman seemed to hate the position into which he'd been thrust upon the death of FDR. He didn't like being there. He didn't like the pressures of the job, the constant pressures of being the president of the United States. But I'm wondering, actually, if we've maybe gone too far into historical psychology in, I don't know, the past 20 or 30 years, thus making Lincoln seem as if he was always on the point or on the brink of a mental breakdown when this isn't really fair to Lincoln. So has this modern focus on psychology been fair to Lincoln?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you that psycho-biography has assumed perhaps an inflated place in the arc of judgment that we have to impose on our leaders. And I'm not even sure if you can make a clinical diagnosis of Lincoln. Although I will tell you that I once made the mistake. I did a Washington Post piece once on 10 things that you think people get wrong about Lincoln. And I wrote, one of them was that he was clinically depressed, because I said in the 19th century, before medications existed, to help people survive that kind of problem, that most depressed people of the time really just took their own lives and were non-functioning. And I never have gotten so many letters about a newspaper piece in my whole career. And they were not friendly letters, I must say. They were from people who suffered from depression, who said I didn't know what the hell I was talking about, that they functioned without medication, the people who wrote, that they struggled through the fog, that they knew they had to survive for their family's sake, for their parents' sake. And so I guess I learned a lesson. And the lesson is it's complicated. Lincoln was very often sad, but he was also very often hysterically funny. And that doesn't make him bipolar. It makes him a complicated person.
Right, well complicated.
He had a lot to be sad about. He'd lost his mother. He nailed her up in a coffin. He had to build a coffin with his dad. And you know, what does that psychologically do to a kid? To put your mother in a box and nail it shut and put her in the ground when he's a kid. He lost his sister in childbirth. He lost children. And 750,000 people died. If that doesn't make you depressed, then you really ought to see a psychiatrist. How could you not be depressed at being maybe not the source or the cause, but one of the reasons why hundreds of thousands, I mean, it would be like 9 million people in America dying. Of course, we're going through a pandemic right now and people are dying left and right, but it was worse in the Civil War in terms of casualties from disease and bullets. So, yeah, why shouldn't he be sad? Why shouldn't he turn to God and all the things that he hadn't done before? It was a brutal hardship on a human being, and so I'm not going to do diagnosis from a distance anymore. But if he was down a lot of the time thinking about the casualties, then he's human.
Yes,
and
yes.
responsible.
Oh, I think so as well. I think in that position, and it is a rare position to which many cannot relate, but anyone who doesn't become quickly and keenly aware of their own moral, mental, and physical complexities just isn't handling the job well.
Right. I mean, not everybody can be, Winston Churchill allegedly had depression too, but fought his way through it. But, the only ones that don't are egomaniacs, I think. Lyndon Johnson didn't have depression. Donald Trump doesn't have depression. I don't think they're very self-aware.
Correct.
So I think you have to have some self-awareness and the ability to feel guilty to be depressed. And you know, Lincoln had the ability to be morose. You know, I left out Anne Rutledge from the litany of people whom he'd lost. You know, his maybe not fiancée, but a woman who had been very close to him back in New Salem. So, you know, it was an age when people died. There was a brother he lost in infancy as well. Not, you know, his parents lost. Death was all around them, and it was hard for them.
I just can't even imagine. But with death in our sights, let's move the story to the tragedies of April 1865. Now, as author Jay Winnick argues, it's one of the most pivotal months in our nation's history. Right. But specifically, let's talk about John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's assassin. Now, the most important question, I think, the most important question that can be asked about Booth is also one of the most difficult to answer. Why did he shoot Lincoln?
Well, you know, there have been so many theories advanced. He was a spy acting on orders from, you know, the remnants of the high command of the Confederacy, and I think he had been functioning in that kind of a role. Maybe not at the top of the class of agents, but he was involved in, you know, resistance activity. And, you know, for my early youth, I was reading that, you know, he was a madman. He was just crazy, you know, acting out the roles that he was playing. And indeed, the last role he played was Julius Caesar with his brothers. He didn't get to be Brutus, but he watched Caesar being assassinated. But I think in the end, it's really racism. Booth is at the White House, in the grounds of the White House, when Lincoln delivers what turns out to be his final speech on April 11th, 1865, in which he calls for giving the right to vote to black people, especially, as he says, the very intelligent or those who've served in the army. That sounds, you know, terrible and restrictive, but to John Wilkes Booth ears, he heard the first time a president ever said that people of color should have the right to vote. And Booth turned to one of his cohorts, probably Lewis Payne, and said, you know, that means Negro equality. And he didn't use the word Negro. That's the last speech he'll ever make. So I think he hears, you know, whatever his ridiculous kidnap plot was, that was never going to work. Now he's stopping the emergence of a mixed-race society. He is a white supremacist from Maryland. He hates black people, and he just ain't going to let it happen. So, of course, he's crazy. You've got to be crazy to do what he did. But I think there's a racist undertone in it, which has been afflicting us for so many centuries. And, you know, we tend to look away occasionally, but it's still there, and it still has to be battled. And, you know, because of a litany of tragic circumstances, not guarding Lincoln properly, letting their collective guard down, thinking the war was over, everything's going to be fine, malice toward none. They didn't quite understand what it would mean to promote equality, or at least even a small baby step toward equality. And it had tragic consequences for Lincoln and for the country to lose him at this moment when we needed expert guidance.
Another question I wanted to ask you, and this one is informed by my reading of Ed Steers, who I read as religiously as I read your work. Ed is just wonderful.
He's terrific.
Yes, terrific. He's publicly stated that he believes that the conspiracy goes a bit higher than the Booth as mastermind narrative, and not that we can know exactly the who, or exactly the when, or exactly the how, or, as we said before, even the why specifically. But are you open to the theory that there are conspirators higher than John Wilkes Booth?
Sure, and I think there was a conspiracy at one point, sanctioned by the Confederate government to do something. Remember, Jefferson Davis had been made aware that with the capture of the Dahlgren letters, that there was a plot at one point that the Union was considering to assassinate the Confederate leaders. So, you know, all's fair, right? And if it is in fact part of the game to kill the commander-in-chief, then then I have no doubt that Ed is right that the Confederate government was involved. I just think that the Confederate government was killed before Lincoln was killed, and it's only a week. But there are no more directives coming from Richmond. Richmond has already been occupied by the North and visited safely, by the way, by Abraham Lincoln in times when civilians had guns. He's walking down the street in full view of people who are not too happy to see him. I mean, the black people are, but the white people aren't. As Lincoln said several times, assassination is in the end is not in the American character. Every time people warned him about the dangers, he would say, it's just, A, if somebody wants to kill me, they're going to kill me. B, it's not an American trait, even though his own strategists had thought about it. So even if Davis, my view is, with all due respect to Ed, who knows much more about this than anybody, including me, if that had been a serious strategy, I don't think it's coming from the top after Appomattox. I think Davis is running for his life. Lee is already sitting in Richmond. He's ripped the insignias off his uniform. He's sitting for a picture by Matthew Brady. He's had it. Johnston is on his last legs in North Carolina, and when he's told that Lincoln is dead, he's horrified and scared to death. So I don't think it's a government thing after April 9th.
Right, and I was watching a panel discussion recently on the Charles Hyam Murdering Mr. Lincoln book, and I believe that it had James Swanson, Michael Kaufman, Tom Turner, and Ed Steers on the panel, and I believe there was someone else that I can't remember who it was. And I believe that Ed and Tom were very open to a higher conspiracy, and I believe it was James and Michael that were very much against it, to the point where I know that James said that he believes in the lone gunman version of the Lincoln assassination, and so that got a good laugh. But
I know all of them, not Michael so much, but I certainly know James, and I know Ed, and I know Tom Turner, and all of the people who've talked about this over the years. Yeah.
But I was also watching one on the assassination, and I believe it was Michael Beschloss that was hosting yourself and Ed Steers together.
Yeah, well, we did a lot of things. We even wrote a book together once, which was a lot of fun.
Yes, a wonderful work called The Lincoln Assassination Conspirators. I have it right here beside me right now, actually. But in doing all of this Lincoln work that you've done and participated in over these decades, I'd like to know from your assessments, what's one way in which we maybe look at Lincoln too critically, and then what is one way in which maybe we aren't critical enough?
Well, in the latter category, I think you're right, that even I've moved on the subject of how justified he was in the crackdown on civil liberties. I mean, I know it's only a retrospective view that the Union could have survived with dissent intact. And I know that other presidents, Woodrow Wilson in war, Franklin Roosevelt in World War II, George W. Bush, even Barack Obama in the waning days of the War on Terror, have all cracked down on dissent and leaks and free press to various degrees. But, it was a different press culture. So Lincoln just overextended and went too far. So that may be a judgment that I've moved a little bit on. I was more forgiving in Lincoln on the Power of the Press 5 years ago than I was in my most recent book, which I know you're going to ask about. But let me get to what I think they're too hard, or some people are too hard on Lincoln. Now, it's the new reckoning on race as not just a subtext, but as a principal text in American history is long overdue, and it's crucial that we remember that aspect of our history and deal with it and acknowledge it. I do think that it is wrong to expect Abraham Lincoln or any electable mainstream politician in the United States in the 1860s to be as enlightened about race as, George W. Bush and Joe Biden. It just wasn't there. So Lincoln is, going to call Sojourner Truth auntie. He's going to not be. It's going to take a while for him to accept African Americans as potential voters. Indeed, as soldiers in the Union Army, even once they're soldiers worthy of equal pay. He is moving slowly but firmly toward an egalitarian view that he didn't have when he got there. And yes, he said some things that make people very unhappy today when they look back, and in fact are inciting some people to say that statues should be torn down. He did say, I don't want to make jurors of black people or voters. I do believe one race is superior, and it's the white race. But he said it in the Senate race in 1858. He is a different person by 1862 and 3, and certainly in the last year of his life in 1865. Same thing with Lincoln and Native Americans. And I have this battle every time I go to Minnesota. Yes, he greenlit the biggest mass execution in federal history. I think it was 36 Sioux Indians in Minnesota in 1862. But he also went over every case himself and pardoned hundreds of people, all of whom were going to be executed because of an Indian raid that resulted in the death of women and children. He wouldn't allow anyone to be executed unless they were personally guilty of murder or rape. And the lawyer in him made him go over hundreds of cases in the middle of the war. People in Minnesota, the white people, said, let's kill them all. We need it for the election, and he wouldn't do it. So again, it depends on whether you're looking through the end of the telescope that magnifies things, as they should, or through the wrong end of the telescope. This is Jim McPherson's metaphor, not mine, where you see things in a reduced scale and don't quite, and think of things as, society and culture being the same in 1860 as it is in 2020.
I had a great history instructor at Southeast Missouri State University in the early 90s. His name was Dr. Christopher Schnell. Absolutely a wonderful man, just probably my favorite instructor that I ever had, and he taught me so much. He's passed away since then, so just absolutely a major influence upon everything I do right now. But I've spoken about him many times on the show. He loved presidential performance surveys, and he spoke of them often in class. And at that time, the one which he was most fond was the Murray Blessing Presidential Performance Survey of 1982. And of course, we talked about the Arthur Schlesinger Sr. polls of 1948 and 1963. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. then sort of took up that mantle. I think he did one around 1996. But the first two Arthur Schlesinger Sr. polls really set the standard, which Murray Blessing then turned up a notch. I remember him questioning, though, the Siena surveys and the Chicago Tribune survey. I don't think he liked the structure of them for some reason. C-SPAN has really sort of taken over this polling over the years, more so just really by the deference of others. But frankly, him talking about them so much hooked me on them, and now I'm still fascinated by them. So for everyone out there who may not know, and I probably should have explained this earlier, these are presidential performance surveys, usually of historians, political scientists, biographers, and some media figures. And the participants then rate the former presidents in a variety of categories. And then from those results, the presidents are then ranked from first to last. And so Lincoln and Washington have, over the years, battled for number one and number two. So, Harold, I want to ask you, do you think that that's accurate for both Lincoln and Washington? Is it clearly a two-man race?
Well, first of all, I've participated in, I think, 3 of C-SPAN's polls. And C-SPAN and my friends Brian Lamb and Susan Swain now have a book about the last survey, and I'm sure they're going to do another survey once the transition is ended here. So I love doing them. It's very hard, by the way. It's not just one vote. You have to rate personality traits, achievements, foreign policy, domestic policy, relations with Congress. It's not easy. So your main question, one of them, they were seen together for generations, the founder and the preserver of the Union, the father and the savior of the country, the person who created the presidency, the person who saved the presidency. But I will now say with a new prejudice in mind, a positive prejudice. So I've spent 5 years in my own post-retirement job, working at Hunter College in New York City at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute, which is a part of Hunter College, but occupies the townhouse where Franklin Roosevelt lived for 25 years leading up to his presidential inauguration. It's the house where he recovered from polio. It's the house where he ran, from which he ran for governor and for president in 1928-30, and then for president 32. It's where he gave his first speech after, by the way, Herbert Hoover didn't concede, even though he won, I think, 7 states. He didn't concede, so Roosevelt had to go on the radio from a room 2 floors below my office in front of a fireplace. I think it gave him the idea of the fireside chat. So I would say I rank FDR up there with Washington and Lincoln. First of all, because he was elected 4 times. Second of all, because he faced not one existential crisis, but 2. The Depression that nearly destroyed the country and capitalism and society, but also the military threat of the rise of fascism, and just mobilizing and winning World War II. And those are 2 heroic accomplishments achieved by a man who was not well when he became president and was practically at death's door at the end, and of course, in fact, did die just 6 weeks after his last inauguration. So I would like to think of this as more as a 1, 2, 3. And if they're interchangeable, that's fine. I would say that Lincoln, for me, always has the edge. Not only because of his presidency, but for 2 other reasons. One, because he lived the American dream, which says in its ideal, and in Lincoln's case in reality, that you don't have to be a rich real estate broker to become, not broker, but real estate person to become president of the United States. You could be born into the poorest of circumstances and educate yourself and become the leader of the country. So he lived the American dream that we're all supposed to be about, making sure that our children can do better than the children who came before us, or do better than their parents. As Lincoln said to a group of veterans who were leaving the service in 1864, he said, "I am the living embodiment that every one of your children can come and live in this big White House just as my father's child has." And that has a lot of power in the American story. And aside from living the American dream, he wrote about the American dream in words that are more brilliant than any words ever written by a political leader in American and maybe world history. People will always study the farewell address to Springfield, the first and second inaugurals, and the Gettysburg Address as expressions of the best of what we can be. Jefferson is second in idealizing the opportunities that America is supposed to represent. But for me, Lincoln is the embodiment and the apostle of democracy.
Yes, and I want to remind everyone who may have plans to now go look at these, please remember that these presidents are solely rated and then ranked on their years spent as president. This is all about presidential performance. So when dealing with someone like a John Adams or a Jimmy Carter or a William Howard Taft even, they are not assessed on their pre-presidential years or their post-presidential years, only the presidencies.
That's true. That's true, because Carter's biggest achievement. Well, I'll tell you, there's a great new book on Jimmy Carter by my friend Jonathan Alter that suggests that we've perhaps judged him too harshly on foreign policy anyway, absent Iran. But that's another story. He's been a more successful ex-president than a president. And you can say the same thing about Taft, I suppose. And you can say the same thing about Hoover. Hoover was an accomplished wartime organizer and did some very good things after he left the presidency. Yeah. You mean when I do those polls, I'm supposed to only think of the presidency? Maybe nobody knows.
I had always assumed that was the case. I do believe those are the parameters, yes.
You're right. Because again, with C-SPAN, it's a very specific checkoff. you have to check off these items, and then you add them all up, and you get a number.
I just can't even think about these processes without seeing their flaws in some places. Okay, so you get the package from C-SPAN, you pull out all the score sheets, and all of a sudden you're supposed to rate Chester Arthur's foreign policy or the congressional relations of, say, the John Tyler administration. Like, is this how it works? Because this cannot be easy, Harold.
No, you have to actually look into it. But if when someone doesn't have many foreign policy crises, you sort of land in the middle. Not having a crisis is good, but not facing down one is not very testing. So maybe Arthur gets a 5 out of 10, just in the fact that there wasn't an explosion. McKinley maybe was too aggressive when the Maine sunk. Did he buy into the yellow journalist's idea that the Spanish had blown up the ship? Did he take us into war for no reason, even though there were fewer casualties than we have in a day of COVID for the entire war? So, yeah, you're right.
And gosh, it has to be hard to rate a Harrison or a Garfield or a McKinley solely because of time spent in office.
Right. Well, most people just pass on Harrison. I mean, what can you say after 30 days, except he should have worn an overcoat when he did his inaugural.
Right. Not the wisest move, I guess.
And made it shorter. That's the takeaway from Harrison. There will be, there is, it's what I'm most interested in. I know we're digressing a little bit here. What I'm most interested in is how the shifts move, how the changes occur, how Jackson has fallen so precipitously in the last few polls from being, 4th or 5th to down to 20th because of things he did before he was president, really, because of the March of Tears to which he subjected Native peoples. I think that's Jefferson and slavery has caused his numbers to go down. Obama has just landed in a hugely high spot. It's kind of like the Hall of Fame voting, Dick Allen, who just died, didn't live long enough to get into the Hall of Fame because he was so unpopular with people. But sometimes it takes 5 votes or 10 votes or 9 years for someone to get elected to the Hall of Fame. Phil Rizzuto of the New York Yankees couldn't even get elected by the Veterans Committee until he was an old man. Anyway, that's a big difference. But people shift within. Clinton is, pretty high. Reagan is. I have to tell you one quick story. So I once unexpectedly was asked to do a television show called Who is Our Greatest American? And the people who argued sat in front of a little bleacher filled with people and made the case for your hero. So somebody did Benjamin Franklin, somebody did, I did Lincoln with Doris Kearns Goodwin, somebody did Washington, and I think Dinesh D'Souza did Ronald Reagan. And so we were on for 3 nights, and then finally the last night, it's between Lincoln and Reagan. And, they show photographs of Lincoln, but they show those clips of Ronald Reagan where he says, tear down this wall, or he says, he's back from his assassination and he's so charming. And Reagan is voted the greatest president of all time. And I'll never forget this. They called Ron Reagan Jr. to tell him the news live, right? So his face appears on screen, and the announcer, whose identity I've forgotten, says, Ron, we just want to tell you that in a contest with Abraham Lincoln, your father has just been voted the greatest president of all time. And he said, you've got to be kidding. So that was the end of that.
No, I can absolutely understand how Ron Jr. would have said something like that. Absolutely. In the last one, it was very surprising to me that Obama was number 12, but it was even more surprising to me that Ike had moved up to number 5.
Yeah, he has really switched places with Truman in a way. There's something to be said for waging peace and not war in certain circumstances. And Eisenhower's warnings about the military-industrial complex have turned out to be true. You can be rated high just on your farewell address, as Washington and Eisenhower have been. I don't know if I'd agree with the Eisenhower versus Truman switcheroo, because I lived through the end of the Eisenhower years, and they were pretty desultory, with the shooting down of Francis Gary Powers and the spy plane and the blow up of the Vienna summit. I'm surprised I remember all that, but that was 1960.
Yeah, I think about Eisenhower, and it's very difficult for me not to go directly to the Iranian coup, to the rise of the national security state, along with the CIA, and then the real lack of leadership on racial issues from someone who is a natural leader, supposedly. So I have a lot of problems there. I also see the rise of covert operations internationally, though, sure, I think Ike has to be largely responsible for that, even though I don't think he directed them from his own desk, per se, but they certainly were allowed to grow. He certainly allowed the ground to be fertile so that they could grow.
I think a lot of the Eisenhower renaissance in the polls is a result, and this is an issue that you've raised very wisely, I think, to pre-presidential reputation. I mean, he was a significant war hero, as was George Washington. And by the way, the other one who's being rehabilitated like crazy is Ulysses S. Grant.
Right.
He's gone from a failure to a great first-term president who tried, unsuccessfully in the end to beat back Jim Crow, the emergence of Jim Crow, fought the Klan, and you can thank Ron Chernow for that rehabilitation, but it's huge.
And, of course, the massive resurgence of Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah, well, he did well for Hamilton as well. Didn't quite rehabilitate some of the financiers he wrote about, but...
Well, the joke was always that when Ron Chernow writes a Christmas card, it's 500 pages. But the rise of Ulysses S. Grant has really been curious. You're absolutely right about that. The categories for the presidential performance surveys in the 90s especially were great, near great, above average, average, below average, and failure. And as you mentioned, Grant was quite commonly ranked as a failure. He was in that bottom category, usually coming in third worst after James Buchanan, who is the perpetual bottom, and then Warren Harding, who is usually between Buchanan and Grant. So therefore, taking that into account, to go from those depths in the presidential performance surveys to being 21st out of 43 in 2018, Grant's rise within the historical community is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, he has had a great rise, and I think the problems are going to be the how George W. Bush, for all of his good intentions, is rated, and where Donald Trump is in his first poll. I would predict there is a very good chance that historians would rate Trump below even Buchanan.
I suspect that. Listen, I think you're correct. I also suspect that's going to be the case. But honestly, that's ridiculously partisan and modernist. And I would hope, and do hope, that professional historians have the historical perspective to see that. Buchanan's administration presided over the worst fracturing of the antebellum era. Thus, it really gave the box of matches to the South so that the fires of secession could really be stoked. It was supportive of the decisions of Supreme Court's Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. Terrible decisions. And it may be the most deer in the headlights, frozen in the most consequential moments in our history that the presidency has ever seen. Because Trump, of whom, believe me, I'm no great fan, because Trump may personally be one of the least impressive, most noxious personalities that has ever graced the Oval Office, because Trump has fractured everyone on Facebook, doesn't mean that his policies are those of James Buchanan.
Well, it's a very interesting thing, and this is what the analysts, who, by the way, shouldn't be the last word anyway. You can't do the last word in 2021 about
that's exactly
Trump
right.
or Barack Obama or any of the recent guys. But I think the judgment will be based on what is more criminal or critical or criticism engendering. Benign neglect of the kind that Harding and Hoover and Buchanan practiced. That is, do nothing and hope, close your eyes and hope that the problem will go away. Or, defying democratic norms, alliances in the foreign policy world. And in the end, he's probably going to get Trump is going to get a lot of credit for his one I think his one achievement is green lighting and pushing the pharmaceutical industry, who will be amply rewarded financially, by the way, to develop a COVID vaccine in record time. That's going to be his big success, and maybe it'll temper his rating. We'll see. I can't wait to do the item-by-item rating of Trump.
I will say this about Trump, and I think this is important on the grand scale, at least for me. I'm strongly anti-war, except in cases of direct and clear attack and response. Strongly anti-war. And Trump, for all his personal negative traits, and he does have many, did not drop the number of bombs on foreign countries, nor did he lead new invasions into countries. And I compare that with the other presidents of, say, the last, 40 years or so. I actually feel like Trump showed more restraint on foreign policy than any other president, actually, in over 40 years.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very good point. Don't say any more, because I don't want you to inflect my rating, my power. I get this.
I will not do that.
Power. But you're right, except for shooting down a few planes in Syria. I guess he has done. He's withdrawn troops. He hasn't deployed them. I think.
Well, I'm absolutely not going to go as far as to call him an advocate of peace, but I do think his intention was de-escalation.
Yeah, he said so. He did say so. That doesn't mean it was wise, but it means that he kept his promise. Well, I'll tell you, the Trump is ending for me my streak of presidents whom I've met and spoken to. So. I guess people who are listening can guess my political orientation, but I go back to, I skipped Reagan, but I did meet Carter, and then from George H.W. Bush all the way to Trump, I've met all those people and discussed Lincoln with many of them, and that is probably the best experience I've had. And the thing that really ties things together is how much modern presidents revere and read about and study Abraham Lincoln. Both Bushes, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, they're all trying to learn from Lincoln to the best of their ability within their own limitations. They were great admirers of Abraham Lincoln, as was Truman, as was Eisenhower, as was Theodore Roosevelt, as was FDR, as was Wilson in his way. They all took from Lincoln, and even Donald Trump, who's I don't think ever read a book about Abraham Lincoln, somehow knows that the only president who rivals him for greatness is Abraham Lincoln. So that's good too.
I do want to ask you about Trump, but more in the context of your most recent work, because you have released in the last year the brilliant The Presidents versus the Press, the endless battle between the White House and the media from the Founding Fathers to fake news. 2020, the publisher is Dutton, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. Once again, Harold, I have to say another fantastic work. I have it myself.
Thank you.
But without making this fully a Trump discussion, which is the unfortunate lens through which it appears that every decision is viewed these days, sadly. Right. We can safely say, I think, in a nonpartisan way and without placing any blame on either side, that Trump had a disastrous relationship with the press. In fact, still has a disastrous relationship with the press. Now, he didn't lock any of them up, and he didn't shut down any of their offices, but it was very bad.
Right.
So my question is, what should the relationship be? Because I wouldn't say that a president needs to be too cozy with the press and vice versa. The president, or the press rather, still need to be the watchman. That's really their first job. And the president, I think, should still have a healthy fear of them, or maybe fear isn't the right word. but I think it's detrimental when it gets to the point of being a partnership where the press admires the president too much, as I believe was the case in the Obama years. Yet Americans can't win when the two sides are at all-out war either. We don't want, I don't think we want the scorched earth type of relationship that Trump has had with the press. Yet I think it does no one any good, for example, when Rolling Stone magazine does more than a few covers where Obama has that sort of faraway, pensive look in his eye with the angelic halo above his head either.
I have to tell you, I was surprised when I did this book because I was inspired to do it when Trump began talking about fake news. And here, I think, and I'm not very popular in some New York quarters for having made this point, here I think Trump is actually not as horrendous as people, in my part of the world make him out to be. Because I think the tradition of presidents fighting with the press, talking about enemies of the people, maybe not quite those words, but fake news, goes back to George Washington. He hated the press after his first term. Adams, as you mentioned, signed an unconstitutional federal law and prosecuted 17 journalists, put them in jail, fined them. Lincoln, 200 newspapers in the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson, his administration censored news, imprisoned several editors. FDR ran a propaganda operation and limited information to the press. But the real shock to me was how much the press disliked and felt they were being used and not informed by Barack Obama. I think they may be embarrassed that they said what they said in the wake of Donald Trump. But, he wiretapped reporters and their families. He rejected thousands of freedom of information requests. So, if anything, Donald Trump has been too accessible.
That's interesting.
And what I say in my book about there are levels of crackdowns, and Trump is not even in the top 5 of those. There is also a strain that I try to get to within my book, that the most successful presidential communicators over the years are those who seized onto new technologies of communication to reach the American people directly. Lincoln did it with public letters in the daily press and using the telegraph to do war communiques at the end of the Civil War. FDR did it with radio and the fireside chats and his great radio voice. Kennedy with his, extremely handsome and witty demeanor in beautifully staged presidential press conferences. Obama, to some extent, he preserves his popularity, which was big, and his reputation through the internet. He introduced the White House website and was enormously popular. Still has more Twitter followers than Donald Trump, by the way. But without question, Trump has made Twitter into a weapon and has been every bit as successful as FDR or Kennedy in terms of glomming onto the latest technology and saying, screw the press, I can talk directly to people, or at least to 80 million of them, not counting retweets, with my Twitter account. And he proved that that was the case. Now, would he have cracked down on the press if he could organize anything? Probably. But he didn't. And that stands, that's important. Where I think the real problem with Trump is that we are left, as he, is either packing or not packing to leave the White House. We know from reports on the day we're speaking here today that Mrs. Trump is packing, so she's leaving. We'll see if her husband follows. But what we're left with is that we no longer agree on fundamental truth in this country. That objective truth itself is now subject to partisan debate. And that's very unhealthy. And that's really scary. And I think the day that Donald Trump took office, his first full day in office, they were talking about the size of the inaugural crowd, which by all measurement, aerial photographs included, was untrue. His inaugural crowd was not bigger than Barack Obama's. Nobody cared except for him. And when Kellyanne Conway went on Meet the Press and said it's not a lie, it's an alternative truth, that was the signal that this was going to be a different time. And I don't know how we get back to at least agreeing on the facts and then debating policy and having different opinions. But if we are disagreeing about who won the presidential election, when that did not even occur in Lincoln's time, the Southerners may have thought that they weren't going to abide by the result, but they didn't question the fact that Lincoln, with 39.9%, but 180 electoral votes, had won. So I think we're in for some very distressing times in this country, as long as people believe in alternative reality, as fed through this, amazing technology that we've developed, but have not quite learned how to control.
But when we're talking about a president's relationship with the media, what is a healthy relationship, Harold? And whose administration do you think best exemplified that?
Well, I think hostile is wrong, adversarial is right. I think Theodore Roosevelt had it right, although he tended to be bossy and punished people he didn't think treated him well or leaked stories. I think FDR was, holding 998 news conferences and just being generally nice to the press, inviting them to dinner or to use the pool that a New York newspaper had paid for or raised money for so that he could continue his rehabilitation. I think, generosity of spirit and is helpful in a president. But also the press has to not have a gotcha culture. They have to have a culture of getting answers and getting to the truth, but not necessarily always looking to destroy. So I think it's almost like the divide between the red and the blue in this country. The divide between the media and the government is pretty extreme. Each one thinks it has to go into the kill, for the kill. And I think Jody Powell had a great quote about Jimmy Carter. He not only did he not get a press honeymoon, he didn't even get a one-night stand. And we'll see what Joe Biden gets. I can see it coming that they're going to think he's too staged and too over-prepared and not accessible enough. But it will be interesting to see how long the honeymoon lasts, if it exists at all. So I think we have to have a quieting down period and a real discussion of how we measure truth. We're not off to a good start since Election Day.
I kind of see Joe Biden as you're about to eat a piece of cake after a really bad meal. Now, it's going to be short.
Well, the problem is it's not very good for you to do that, though.
Exactly. It's not going to last long. The joy of the piece of cake is not going to last long, but it is absolutely going to seem like a little refreshing because the meal was so distasteful.
Well, you know what I think you have to do to get through it? You have to have a nice cup of Irish coffee. So it has to be, in honor of Joe Biden, has to be spiked with a lot of whiskey or something, and then the dessert, that's accompanied by a shot. I think we'd be okay. We'll see.
Harold, I've long been interested in biographers and those who spend decades writing about, say, one subject or one time period or one event. And I ask you this knowing that it's not the case with all biographers, but in general, if you spend 5 to 8 years on one person's life, I think it's natural that you begin to empathize or even like the person. You want to know as much as you can about them. You read their own words in their own hand. You're trying to think and anticipate as that person. You're inside their head and you're inside their heart. And I think you become so engrossed with the subject of your work that you become invested then in that person's reputation. So do you think that this work, the work of the biographer and the work of the great historians, cause some of them to become too... Are biographers not critical enough of their subjects because of the time they spend with them?
The Lincoln community seems to be different because I'm not sure there is another specialty where people stay focused on the subject for decades and stay with it. I wouldn't call myself a biographer more as much as an historian, but people like Chernow and Doris Goodwin and write about Lincoln or the period well, and then they move on to other things. You wouldn't call David McCullough a Truman biographer because he also writes about the Wright brothers and Lewis and Clark and the Brooklyn Bridge, or the Johnstown flood. But there are people in the Lincoln community who've been doing this in their various specialties for 40 and 50 years. Some of the ones who I knew who passed on for more. For David Donald did it for 50 years. Richard Curran did it for 50 years. There's something about Lincoln, the mystery of him, the nuances of him, the fact that he's a touchstone for democracy, got us through our worst period. That is endlessly fascinating, and I think, again, with objective truth, he was the greatest American. I still think that, as I did when I was 11 years old and first got interested in this subject. And I think there are new analyses and new things to write about all the time, from his birth to Ed Steers and his death. So something about Lincoln. I think the current lot is critical and at least brings critical analytical skills to the subject of Lincoln. So I don't think he gets a free pass by any means. But endlessly inspiring, yes. A source of inspiration and study, yes, absolutely. Still, for me anyway.
As a Lincoln historian, and I always wonder this, when a new work comes out on Lincoln, and there are still multiple works that come out every year, and I think, just as a fan of these works, I think they're very good, actually. But as an historian who knows much more than I, the average book buyer, are you of the mindset that you're more likely to read them? Are you more likely not to read them, or to wait until someone says, hey, Harold, you should really read this book, it's got some important things in it? Or do you just sort of shrug and say, there's probably not much new there, it's just maybe a new interpretation? Are you still excited to read the new works on Lincoln? I
have so many jokes I could do in response, but I'm going to be very serious. No, I'm excited, and it's and the nice thing for me is that I know most of these people. I've known them for a long time, and so when Ted Widmer writes a book about the inaugural journey, maybe I say, what's new? But then I find out that there is new stuff. He's made some wonderful discoveries, and he's also a beautiful, beautiful writer. So I enjoyed his book. David Reynolds has written a really provocative, original book called Abe about Lincoln and the culture. I don't agree with everything in it. I don't agree with everything Ted Widmer said either, in terms of what he wrote about and what he omitted. I said that in a review, actually. But I was really thrilled that these new books are out there, and I know which books are coming, and I'm excited about those too. So, yeah, I have a ball with it. Maybe I'm jealous, but I'm not uninterested.
I always find it interesting and a little bit elitist, actually, when an historian will come out and say, oh, there's not much new in that book. I always think about it from the perspective of the book buyer, who may or may not have ever heard that story, or may or may not have any other books on that subject. To them, the whole book is new. The whole book is new information.
Yeah, I think that's a great point.
Right.
But
the writer is writing for the public, for the people, not for other historians.
That's right. And anytime an author can make people focus on things for a new generation. When David Donald wrote his book Lincoln, which is quoted so often now, although I don't think historians should quote modern books, it introduced Lincoln to a whole bevy of people, as did Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals. So James McPherson with Battle Cry of Freedom, combined with Ken Burns' Civil War, both of those guys are responsible for the Renaissance. They're the Medicis of this field. They just rejuvenated it. Maybe the Medicis is the wrong comparison, but they stimulated interest after years of dormancy. Used to be that Lincoln and the Civil War were only popular during wars. It's an interesting historiographical analysis, and it's been the most powerful and long-lasting efflorescence of Lincoln scholarship in history. It's gone on for 25 years now, thanks to those. I really credit them a lot, and Doris Goodwin, they keep it going. And so there's always something. You're right, for new generations and new takes on things, and it's wonderful. And I left my friend Tony Kushner and Steven Spielberg out of the mix too. And that film, which was so wonderful, and I had the chance to work on a little bit, which was an exciting, if frustrating, experience. That certainly helped keep it going too.
I love talking to working historians. I taught high school history for close to 10 years, and now I have the honor and the blessing to be able to host this show and have publications that continue to teach history to an even larger audience. Believe me, there is nothing else I would rather be doing than this. It is just such an honor and such an obligation. But I feel blessed doing this every single day, and it's kind of my own very, very small media empire, very small at this point, an empire of one. But I love talking to historians about the origin of their love for history. Mine began with my father and my great uncle, and then continued through Dr. Christopher Schnell, who I talked about earlier in the show. Who inspired yours?
Well, I credit two people, one of whom was just, a heroic figure, and one was a real person and in my life. And the heroic one was President Kennedy. I think when he arrived on the scene, I was 11 years old, and it was the first time I was ever interested in a national presidential election. I remember Stevenson Eisenhower, version number 2, but I didn't, have any real interest in it. But something about the Kennedy election caused me to be interested in politics, which has been a part of my life as well, my professional life. And then when he rejuvenated the Civil War centennial, sort of got it going again after it had been lying dormant, and then I read that he wouldn't let the commission, the Centennial Commission, stay at a hotel in Charleston because the one African-American member of the commission was not allowed to stay there. He demanded that they stay at a naval base or an army base instead. There was like a combination of enlightened politics and history that just turned me on. And in that same period, the Civil War Centennial is going on, and Harper's Weekly is being republished. Bruce Catton is writing books, so it's a great time to become interested. But a year before that, or two, but maybe one, I had a 5th grade and 6th grade. So this is probably one of those grades. I had her for both 5th and 6th grade. She came into class one day, literally with a hat filled with the names of historical figures, folded up. And we were asked to line up and choose a name from the hat, and then go up to the school library. We were in elementary school in a middle school, so there was a middle school library. And go upstairs and pick out a book about that person, read it, and then write a report. I think we called it a composition in those days. And I actually picked Abraham Lincoln's name from the hat. So fate or, heaven or somebody was guiding me. My best friend picked Genghis Khan, and he became a rock and roll promoter. So these things can be very influential. And I went upstairs to the library, and I picked out Richard Current's book, The Lincoln Nobody Knows. And I was just enthralled. And by 1962, I was reading everything, and I got the book by Stephen Laurent, Lincoln, A Picture Story of His Life, which was a serious book about Lincoln images, about which I later wrote. And then I started writing to these people. So I go back to Mrs. Henrietta Janke, my 5th grade teacher, as the person who brought in the hat that contained the names from which I somehow miraculously and fortunately picked Abraham Lincoln.
Wow. Great story. I think we should all be thankful to the people that sort of got us into the fields that we were in. They sort of paved our paths. So that's a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing it with us. When you have a college kid or high school kid, or even an adult, I guess, come up to you and say, thank you so much for your work. It really inspired me, or it inspired my love for history. That has to be an awesome feeling.
Well, it cuts both ways. It's very exciting. And I certainly told the people who influenced me about how much they meant to me in my time. I got to know Stephen Laurent, and I knew Richard Current, and I knew David Donald, and Don Fehrenbacher, all of the old school of Lincoln historians, Gerald McMurtry, who was the head of the Lincoln National Life Foundation and the editor of the Lincoln Herald, who published my first article in 1974 and advised me to specialize. A great advice he gave me. It was another person I should actually acknowledge. He said, don't just write a book about Lincoln. Pick something that interests you and that you think is neglected. So I went right to the images of Abraham Lincoln, and I think he was responsible for that. So yes, I love when people say that I've been helpful, or I don't know if anybody said I've been inspiring, but that they've used, liked my work or used it. But it also makes me feel really old. So I'm not sure it's always
I know that
positive,
feeling.
especially if like a teacher or someone who's actually working in the profession says that they read my book when they were 10. That's that's a little weird. So I can't believe I've been doing this for so long. I still remember being a 20-something-year-old working in this field. I was in my 20s when I published my first articles in the Lincoln Herald. So I try to treat everybody the way I was treated. There was nobody in the Lincoln. I mean, there are now who I don't like, but there was never anybody in the Lincoln field who was ever discouraging. Well, there were some who were nutty, but nobody was discouraging. Everybody I met, and I met all the greats, they were always encouraging. And by the way, I had the same luck when I became a political press secretary. When I was in my 20s, I dealt with jaded journalists who smoked and drank, and they treated me professionally. So the best I can do when I get the compliments or the questions or people ask me to read their manuscripts is to treat them with the same respect and encouragement with which I was treated. I think I owe that to the field and to the next group of people who are rising in the profession. So I try to do that.
So before I let you get back to the research, and to bed, actually.
Bed? Yeah, are you kidding? It's my bedtime.
I want to ask you, what comes next for Harold Holzer? What kind of books can we expect to see within the next, say, few years?
Well, I want to do the paperback version of The Presidents versus the Press, and I sort of left my Trump chapter with ellipses because it's very hard to write about living people for me, but harder to write about a presidential administration that had not ended and was still going on and might have still gone on, of course, had he been reelected. So I want to conclude the chapter, maybe add a few things. I have an idea of how to do a new introduction if they let me. I've been spending a lot of time doing television and radio and blogs, and but it is a very tough time for books, I will say. If you look at the New York Times bestseller list, it's really athletes and television personalities, and books are just not doing well. There are no bookstores that are open in this country, and it's really hard, and just a tough time for history. Books were postponed during the pandemic, and they didn't get the timing that they were supposed to. So, not complaining, but it's a tough time. So I do have another project that I'm going to do, Lincoln and Immigration.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and I don't know how many years it's going to take, but I actually have done. I hope my editor is not listening. I've done practically no work on it, but I've thought about it. And, I had to choose to do one project and leave one aside about 4 years ago when Trump became president. Looking at 4 years down the road, I had to decide what is going to be the most topical thing when Donald Trump is running for re-election. Is it going to be immigration? And he certainly ran in 2016 on the basis of the wall and Muslim immigrants and Mexicans and all of that. Or is it going to be the treatment of journalists? And I was more interested in the journalists, and I think that did turn out to be the more enduring issue, fake news and whether the media was fair or not. So I do have an obligation to do the immigration book, and that's what I'll do next, because I think that is something we have to address, and hopefully the same way Lincoln addressed it. Stay tuned.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being on the Midnight Rider News Show. This was really a great time. It was exactly what I hoped it would be, and thank you so much for that.
Well, this has been a great talk. I've enjoyed it.
I absolutely would like to have you back on the show down the road to talk about a few more things. I think there's an endless amount of material that we could cover with Lincoln, but also with historiography as well.
I'd like to, especially if you ask great questions like this again, if you can think of more. I've enjoyed it, and I'm honored that you would say such nice things about me, and let's stay in touch.
Yeah, we'll do that. Absolutely. It'll be really nice to have you back on and have an episode quite like this. I want to say thank you to Harold Holzer. He's the author of The Presidents versus the Press, the endless battle between the White House and the media, from the founding fathers to fake news. It's available on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, or at anywhere else where you can buy great history books. And by the way, you should be buying great history books. Like Harold said earlier, the history book market has sort of tanked this year. We need to support these historians, and we need to support their work. So please do so. The Presidents versus the Press, the endless battle between the White House and the media, from the founding fathers to fake news, by Harold Holzer. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.